Good afternoon, everybody. I realize Katie and I have the tough slot here right after lunch, but we're going to do everything we can to keep you all awake. Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction, and thanks goes to Kevin and William and everybody who's putting this on. It's been wonderful. This afternoon, I'm going to be spending a few minutes talking about a man named Robert Beverley. Beverley was an extremely wealthy Virginia planter who left behind an extraordinary letter book that dates between 1760 to about 1792. Scholars of material culture, architecture, and even traditional historians have mined his letter book for decades. For those of us who are interested in material objects, it reveals in-depth purchases for furniture, detailed orders for Chinese porcelain, paint colors, wallpaper, and even furnishing textiles. But his letter book, back to his factors in London, which detailed clothing purchases for over 15 years, has largely been ignored. Beverley kept a lively and extremely descriptive correspondence for over a decade with a group of tradesmen who provided him clothing from London. The letters reveal his ever-changing need of garments, his disdain for poor workmanship, and the global trade connections made from rural Virginia to London, the center of English fashion. Beverley could have easily purchased any of these objects that we're going to be talking about today in Virginia, but ultimately it was cheaper and was far more fashionable than anything being produced in Tidewater, Virginia. And just here on the screen are some of a few pieces that actually still survive from Beverley to this day, both of which are in our collection at Clothiers. Now, just a few things, sort of housekeeping notes before we get too far. Sadly, to date, there is no surviving portrait that exists of Robert Beverley. We know there was at least one. In 1774, Beverley wrote to one of his factors and stated, quote, "My wife desires you will send her a miniature picture of myself drawn from that I gave your father. It must be set neatly and plainly in gold to wear around her neck or by way of pendant, or as a bracelet." Now, this miniature portrait is also lost. So we don't have an image of him. So I'm going to be using a lot of stand-in Virginians, locals, to help illustrate some of the garments that Beverley was ordering. And the second point is that the surviving letter book from Beverley, unfortunately, I don't think it's complete after going through it over and over again. It also may speak that he had several letter books all at the same time, and this is just what was collated from those surviving letters. So there are some large gaps in the correspondence, and I'll note that as we go through them, but it's not all there. Robert Beverley came from a distinguished pedigree of Virginians who first came to Virginia in the middle of the 17th century, settling here in Middlesex County, which is in orange, and then in Essex County, which is in blue, along the Rappahannock River, which of course was known for some of the best tobacco land in Virginia. Beverley's grandfather, also Robert Beverley, not to be too confusing here, was born in the 1660s and died in 1722 and was known as the historian because he actually writes the first history of Virginia, published in London in 1705. Robert Beverley, was born on August 21st, 1740 at his father's plantation called Blandfield in Essex County, Virginia. He was a second son, but sadly, his older brother died at a very young age, which of course moved him into the position to inherit his father's vast estate. At the age of 10, Robert's father, William, took him to England to begin his formal education, a common practice amongst wealthy Virginians. In 1750, he enrolled at the Wakefield School. In 1757, Robert moves to London and begins reading law at the Middle Temple, and was called to the bar on February 6, 1761. Now, it was during this early time in England when Robert's father probably introduced him to Edward Atholls and his son Samuel. Atholls was a major tobacco factor working in London. He purchased tobacco from many Virginia planters, such as the Beverleys, and sold it on the London market. Now, it's important to keep in mind that tobacco was a 12 to 14 month crop, And so Virginia planters would take credit out against their tobacco coming to market in hopes that it would sell at a good price, which of course leads to a lot of strain amongst these guys because they're holding over huge amounts of debt annually. Athol's was just one of a litany of men Robert worked with in order to sell his tobacco. He also worked with this guy on the screen, this really cool reverse painted glass miniature, guy named John Backhouse. He was based in Liverpool. And then just a little mapping to kind of help us out here a little bit. The Justice Scales are the Middle Temple. That's kind of where Robert's hanging out most of the time, or where he should be hanging out most of the time, reading law. Edward Athol's, he is at the dollar sign right there on Cannon Street, just north of London Bridge. Now, he also worked with a fellow who is here, a guy named John Morton Jordan. He was based on Fenchurch Street. And then he also had a cousin who was just north of there on Lime Street, a guy named John Bland. Now, I know who Beverley was writing to generally in this letter book. He oftentimes notes it, but it's not always noted. So again, when we get into these letters here, we'll note when we can who he's actually writing to. But these are his factors, the guys who are dealing with all of his money. February 28, 1756, Robert's father, William, dies at his home in Virginia. And this sets into motion Robert settling his accounts in London and preparing to come back home. It would take Robert 5 years before stepping foot back on Virginia soil in the early spring of 1761. He was now one of the wealthiest planters in Virginia, producing about 90 to 100 hogsheads of tobacco a year. Keeping in mind, it's 1,000 pounds of tobacco per hogshead. Beverley also inherited over 100,000 acres of land in the Shenandoah Valley that his father acquired to sell and rent to newly arriving immigrants. Needless to say, Robert Beverley had a lot on his hands to manage at the young age of 22. Now, it wasn't long after he arrived back in Virginia that Robert is already trying to connect with Athol's back in London. He admits to Athol's that life in Virginia is expensive and that he had much, quote, rather be an inhabitant of Britain upon 500 pounds anno than to blaze away here upon 4 times the sum. On July 11, 1761, we learn of our first tradesman and have Robert's first request of clothing. Beverley wrote, quote, I desire Scot, the tailor in Stanhope Street, Clare Market, to send me a pair of black silk breeches and 2 pairs of drawers. Christopher Scot, spelled his name with both 1 or 2 T's, was at the end of his career when working for Beverley. He was located here on Stanhope Street, just north of St. Mary le Strand Church. Christopher Scot was born on February 14th, 1722, Valentine's Day, in the St. Pancras area of London to his parents, Edward and Jean Scot. Christopher was probably apprenticed to the tailor's trade around the age of 10 or 12 and served a 7 to 10 year apprenticeship. The early Westminster rate books placed Scot on Stanhope Street as early as 1749. Now, the breeches desired by Beverley may have looked like the pair seen here on the screen in our collection at Colonial Williamsburg. Of course, breeches cover the man from the hip to right below the knees where they fasten with a garter. Likewise, he ordered a pair of drawers. Underdrawers are rare survivors from this period. Beverley's may have looked like the pair on the screen, which open down the center front and simply tie at the knees, and there's 2 buttons at the waist. Now, 2 months later, Beverley is already writing back for more clothing. He wrote, quote, I wrote to Christopher Scot, tailor, for 2 coats of Duroy, lined with silk, another with brown holland, a pair of black silk breeches and 6 white holland waistcoats, and to ask at Pope's, the hosier, for 6 pairs of white silk stockings. Beverley had spent nearly half of his life in England and at this point probably forgot about the sultry, hot, and humid climate of Virginia. Stephen Hawtrey, while writing to his brother Edward in 1769, who was about to move to Williamsburg to teach the College of William and Mary, warned his brother about the heat. He wrote, Dear Ned, the heat is beyond your conception. Your cloth suit unlined may do for the month of May, but after that time you must wear the thinnest stuffs that can be made without lining. You must carry with you a stack of linen waistcoats made very large and loose, that they mayn't stick to your hide when you perspire. Now, Beverley's order shows, his immediate need for summer wear. And here on the screen, you can see some examples of Duroy, that textile that he's asking to have his coats made out of. When he, in Hawtrey's letter, right, to his brother, he talks about wearing the thinnest stuffs. Stuffs is actually a textile. It's probably something similar to what you see here, a hard-spun worsted wool. Duroy, as I said, is hard-spun worsted wool and was a staple in the hotter months in England and in her warmer colonies. This letter also introduces us to another tradesman working for Beverley, a hosier by the name of Peter Pope. Pope was born on December 31st, 1720 in Maidstone. He was the son of a thread hosier and was apprenticed to William Dodson, who worked in Suffolk just south of the London Bridge. Now, after his apprenticeship, he opened his own business. While he had several locations over the time period we're talking about, during this period, he was most usually located here on ThreadneedleStreet. Interestingly, Beverley probably met Pope through Athol's, as Athol's son, Peter, was his apprentice. Athol's is literally just south of where Pope is located. The following month, Beverley wrote to London to settle a debt. On October 10th, 1761, he wrote, quote, "Please pay £2 odd shillings to Fell, a tailor in St. Martin's Lane near Leicester Fields, and place to my account for debts that I contracted and forgot to pay while I was in England." William Fell operated a tailor shop located here on the left-hand side of your screen. Fell seemed to have a very active tailor shop. In 1774, he testified at the Old Bailey as a character witness for a murder trial. Fell stated, quote, I am a tailor in St. Martin's Lane. I have known Mr. Franklin about 4 or 5 years. Franklin was the man who was on trial. Fell continued, I knew him as a wine merchant. He was a customer of mine whom I made clothes for. I have not in the course of my business seen Mr. Franklin very much, having more business than I can do myself. It comes sometimes with my servants. Now, Fell stopped working with Franklin as he could not tend to his personal finances, it seems. But Fell remained in business with several other partners, including his son, and you just saw his trade card in the previous slide, until they all declared bankruptcy in 1787. As I said before, he was located on the left-hand side of the screen here at the other pair of scissors. On November 10th, 1761, Beverley wrote looking for yet a few more things. He stated, quote, I wrote you sometime since and enclosed a letter to Watson, a shoemaker in New Round Court in the Strand, next to Marsh's, a bookseller at Talley's Head. He desired he would send me 6 pairs of shoes, which he was to be paid for by you. Now, sadly, Watson remains slightly anonymous to our research centuries later. Perhaps he was Jonathan Watson, who was working in St. Martin's Street when he voted in the 1749 Westminster election. If it is the same person, he moved his shop to here by the 1760s at New Round Court in the Strand. Now, Watson must have kept his customers' measurements in order to keep making their shoes. Other Americans who wanted English-made shoes had the options of filling out measuring cards, like the one you see here on the screen, from the Philadelphia merchant Edward Shippen. Shippen ordered several pairs of shoes from the famed John Didsbury, who included a neatly engraved trade card to show his customers how to measure their feet from abroad. Now, the same letter that Beverley ordered the shoes, he also requested, quote, 2 of the best hats at 1 guinea each of Adams and Parr at the Hat and Beaver in Fleet Street with a fashionable cock. John Adams trained as a felt maker in the 1730s in London, and in the 1750s, Adams took on an apprentice named Charles Parr. By the 1760s, Parr and Adams are in partnership with one another. They were variously listed as haberdashers, hatters, and hosiers throughout both of their careers, and their shop was located here at the corner of Fleet Street and Wine Office Corner. This is the same street of the famed Ye Old Cheshire Cheese pub, if you've visited. This order to London would end Beverley's first year back in Virginia, but his purchasing is going to grow exponentially here in just a few moments. On January 10th, 1762, Robert is back to writing Athol's for items, specifically 6 pairs of neat, thin shoes, 3 pairs neat thick shoes, 2 pairs of single channel pumps of Watson the shoemaker, New Round Court, Strand. And we're going to see that Beverley really likes Watson and his shoes, and he's going to become a repeat customer here. Now, by March, he is back to ordering some clothing. March 3rd, 1762, quote, Mr. Scott, I desire you will make me a scarlet haired shag frock coat, a plain superfine green cloth waistcoat, and breeches with plain buttons. The cloths always to be large enough. Let the coat be of the best sort of shag, and if any other color waistcoat is more fashionable, send it. Now, after all those summer pieces, it's hard to believe that one would need a shag frock coat. On screen is an example of a shag waistcoat in the Henry Ford collection to give you an idea of exactly what it may have looked like. But of course, it's a coat, full length, quite long. Despite looking a bit like Sesame Street's character Elmo, the long shaggy pile would certainly be very warm and make a statement. Beverley also asked Atholls to purchase him, quote, a pair of the best doeskin breeches of Jones in James Street, Longacre. Rice Jones was a leather breeches maker located here. Jones was born on February 23rd, 1702 in St. James, Piccadilly. Now, the great irony about buying leather breeches in London and then shipping them back to the colonies is that the colonies exported the deerskins to England. By the late 1760s, nearly 700,000 pounds in weight of deerskins were annually being exported from the American colonies to be turned into primarily leather breeches. Now, by the time that this letter reached London, Rice Jones was actually already dead. The business passed to his brother, who placed his son Thomas in charge, and sadly, Thomas went bankrupt by 1768. In July 1762, Beverley places yet another order. He writes, quote, it seems that I must be continually writing to you for something or the other. I desire you will make me, 1, a crimson corded silk French frock, waistcoat and breeches, and line it with silk of the same color. Make a neat embroidered buttonhole of silver, plain garters to the breeches, also a suit of light colored silk jeans, 4 pairs of nankeen breeches, and 6 pairs of linen drawers. That's also going to Scott the tailor in the red circle there on the screen. As I said, we're back to Christopher Scot, and Beverley orders a classic Virginia suit, as you can see on the screen here, a ditto suit, meaning all 3 pieces matching of a high quality silk with no gold or silver laces, except for the buttons. And this certainly fits in the, quote, neat and plain style often described of the Tidewater Virginians that they fell into. The portrait on screen here of Peter Randolph of the Richmond, Virginia area shows perhaps what that suit may have looked like, and the sprig on the button, what it may have actually looked like as well, as it's pretty much an identical style suit that Beverley ordered. But Beverley also ordered 4 pairs of nankeen breeches. Nankeen cotton was imported to North America from China by way of England, and comes to the forefront as one of the most common textiles used by men, especially for breeches. Unlike cottons grown in North America that we commonly know producing, sort of snow white-like fiber, nankeen naturally produces this warm sort of yellow golden fiber, so it's naturally colored this way. Now, the end of 1762 marks a sudden stop, or maybe a hiatus, to Beverley's personal clothing purchases. Perhaps it's a larger change in his life, and Beverley hints at this change when he wrote on December 27th, 1762, quote, I have some thoughts on my changing situation in life, and I believe before you receive this, I shall become a married man. Robert Beverley married Maria Carter, daughter of Landon Carter of Savin Hall, on February 3rd, 1763. Now, here's one of our gaps. From December 1762 to 1769, few letters survive detailing Beverley's clothing. In 1767, his old tailor, Christopher Scot, up there in the corner, dies. By 1769, he begins to work with the tailoring firm of Richard Mason and John Smither, and they were located here just south of Scott on Arundel Street, south of the Strand. On March 4th, 1770, he writes to Mason and Smither with another litany of items. He says, quote, I wrote you sometime since for a pair of scarlet breeches of the same kind of cloth as my coat, with the same sort of buttons, some of which, both large and small, I beg you will send me, as they are very uncommon here. I desire you will make me a frock suit of superfine dark blue with basket or mohair buttons, which should be most fashionable. You will line it with the best shalloon of the same color, and the sleeves of the coat with dimity or fustian. I shall want it for the winter, and put up a few spare buttons. They must be made fashionably, as frock clothes are worn, and breeches are to be made without lining. Perhaps the suit looks something like Thomas Bowling here, you can see on the screen, in his dark blue ditto suit, breeches, waistcoat, and coat. Now, Beverley continues from that same long letter already. He writes, quote, the last suit that Mr. Scot made for me, the scarlet one which you sent me, fitted me so well that I beg you'll observe their measure exactly, as I've grown much fatter than when I was in England. Now, at least Robert's being honest about his changing body, but it does beg the question, how did these unfinished projects or perhaps measures make it to the shops south of the Strand? Did Scott shops keep patterns or measures? Did Athol send someone to pick up the unfinished goods to bring them to Mason and Smither? Scott had at least measures taken from Beverley on hand. Tailors, of course, took measurements not with inch measuring tapes as we traditionally think of today, but they typically measured with narrow strips of paper, and then they cut into them to mark the physical measurement off the body. You can see the tailor here on the screen has got the little pair of snips in his hand to actually cut into the paper. A physical measurement from the body, as I said, versus a numerical measurement. Paper inch tapes did not come into popularity amongst tailors until the early 19th century. Now on screen here, this is pretty cool, is to date the only surviving example of this measuring system, which was found in the papers of George Washington. When ordering hats for Washington's enslaved livery, he used a slip of paper just like a tailor would have to take the width around their heads, and then denoted it directly onto the paper itself. Unfortunately, it's fragmentary, but this is what it says. The whole length of the paper is the circumference of Giles's cap measured at the bottom, and on the inside being the exact band of his, we don't know what it says because it's gone, but there's a second line in there that says the black line drawn across the paper is the size of Paris's cap. So Washington was making these and sending them to his factors in London. Now, after this reintroduction and explicit set of instructions, Beverley carries on his usual business, regularly ordering more shoes from Watson, among other things. And it's also worth mentioning that Mason breaks from the original partnership, leaving Smither as the sole proprietor. Quick note from Beverley in January 1773, he wrote John Smither stating, quote, you'll be pleased to make me a neat, plain frock suit of clothes of the very best superfine cloth, lined with the best ratnet and buttons of the same color. I would have it neither gay nor dull. The coat fitted me extremely well, except the breeches, which were a ½ inch too large at the knees and continued gradually up to the flap. The waist of the waistband must be made a ½ inch longer, and the breeches must not be lined. And perhaps the suit looks something like the plain cloth suit worn here by merchant Thomas Newton from Norfolk, Virginia. Now, beyond the new suit, he also asks for another pair of the thinnest doeskin breeches, but we don't know the maker. Definitely not Rice Jones. Now, the spring of 1774, the tensions between England and American colonies are coming to a head. In protest to the Tea Act of 1773, on December 13th of that year, the Bostonians dumped 240 chests of tea into the harbor. Parliament then passed a series of acts, including the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. Word of this and rumors of another non-importation agreement sort of swirling about, Beverley seems to start doing some panic buying, not knowing what the future might hold. In early 1774, he orders over 50 pairs of shoes for his children alone. He also writes Smithers stating, quote, I received the suit of clothes which you sent me in the spring. They fit me extremely well, and I beg you will constantly observe that measure until I think the contrary. You will be pleased to make me a frock coat of the best, thinnest, superfine broadcloth, but not Londres cloth without lining, and a buff kerseymere waistcoat and breeches. The waistcoats to be lined with linen, the breeches without lining. The coat to have mohair buttons and molds of the buttons of the waistcoat and breeches to be something that will not stain in washing. I like not metal buttons by any means, and you will also make a dark colored jean frock coat without lining, 2 jean white waistcoats and breeches of the very finest sort. The waistcoat and breeches without linings, and you are always to make an allowance on the sides of the waistcoats to be let out. Now, Beverley, he's got some growth problems, I guess. I don't know. Beverley pens the last line in his request to Smither, quote, observe my directions and be sure that you make them by the measure of the last suit of clothes. Very insistent. Because I shall never more have anything made in this country in the apparel way. Beverley seems to be siding with the ideals of this infantile rebellion brewing in North America. But I guarantee you, he's going to go order more clothing. We are not going to end here. Jean is a very utilitarian cotton or cotton linen blend that was commonly made in the Manchester region of England. Beyond the material it is made from, it is woven with a distinctive twill pattern, making it very hard wearing, very much akin to our modern denims today. This piece on the screen is from a swatch book at the Winterthur Museum from the Henry Remsen Company, dated to 1767. What's really great about it is the top of the page, it's listed as Jean. It's great when they label those things for us as historians later. Now, another thing is someone as myself who loves to study objects is when you have a written reference or description that then matches an extant garment. And here we have a waistcoat in our collections at Colonial Williamsburg, worn by an Englishman named Tailor White, brand new to our collection, just got it a couple months ago. But you can see that little triangle. Well, that's extra allowance added in to be let out later. So just like Beverley requested, Taylor Scott in England also requested that as well. Now, by the fall of 1774, tension is at an all-time high. Beverley writes to London on September 6, 1774 to Atholls and says, it is almost impossible to represent to you how much Americans are agitated at present by the violent and unjust proceedings of Parliament. A delegation is assembled in Congress at Philadelphia to consider what measures will be most proper to adopt at this alarming crisis. Now, in this letter, Beverley expresses concern after hearing sad news about his old trustworthy shoemaker Watson in New Round Court. He wrote, I have requested Captain Gibson to deliver you an old shoe, that Pritchard may make me 2 pairs of the same kind. You may tell him if he makes my shoes well, I shall be an excellent customer, as I have 4 sons who wear out a great many shoes. By the by, I think it is cruel to leave Watson, especially if poverty is the greatest object to him. I have therefore wrote to him for 4 pairs of shoes, and by that means I'll see who I shall like best. Now, it seems as if Beverley has found that his favorite shoemaker, Watson, has fallen upon hard times. John Pritchard is located actually right off the screen here in Swallow Street in the West End. Now, in the same letter, this is a very long letter, Beverley pens yet another note to John Smither. He says, quote, I've received the clothes you've sent me, which fit me extremely well. The color of the cloth coat I do not admire. The white jean waistcoat and the breeches are not made of the stuff so fine as I desired, and the buttonholes were sewed so miserably with such very coarse thread that they unraveled upon the first washing, and I've been obliged to have them re-sewed. But in every other respect, I like them. I now desire you will make me a frock suit of the very best superfine broadcloth, lined with either ratnet and equipped with the very best trimmings of all kinds. Buttons of the same color, either mohair or wire, whichever should be most fashionable. The breeches to be lined with linen. Also, 2 white jean waistcoats, 2 pairs of breeches, 2 pairs of the very finest white drill breeches. These are washing articles without lining. A very dark colored jean frock and coarse fustian frock to wear about my plantation business. Let these things be made of the very best and neatest materials, the fustian frock accepted. And I think if the breeches were about a ½ inch longer at the knee, it would sit better. Although I wish you would be careful to observe the last measure and not to confuse it with the former one. The unhappy disputes subsisting at the time between Great Britain and the colonies have compelled us to, by the efficacy of a non-importation. You will therefore comply with this order, provided that differences should be adjusted, and of this Mr. Atholls will inform you. In your last account, I am charged with silk garters to my buff breeches, which have cloth, so you will make that adjustment upon my account. Now, Beverley clearly is foreshadowing the non-importation agreement, which the Grand Congress meeting in Philadelphia adopted on October 20th, 1774, effectively ending all of the imports of all British goods coming to the American colonies starting December 1st, 1774. More than likely, Beverley would never receive this detailed order of clothing from Smither. In an undated letter, but probably written around the late fall of 1774, Beverley gives a last-ditch sort of Hail Mary attempt at the goods that he ordered to get them imported before the cutoff date of December 1st. He wrote to Atholls and stated, quote, "I have enclosed an order to Smither and another to Watson, which I beg me be complied with as soon as an accommodation takes place, as I shall be much in want of everything as possible, as this possibly may be the last opportunity I have of writing you, as the post over the Atlantic will be discontinued, I am afraid, for many months. You will oblige me much by examining any articles Smither may send, as I do not think he furnishes such materials as he ought. And if any kind of fashionable frock dress strikes your fancy particularly, instead of those I have desired, to send it, and also send me from Pritchard 4 pairs of shoes, one of each kind according to the measures sent last year by Gibson." Here the correspondence ends. Non-importation takes hold on December 1st, 1774. War breaks out in April of 1775, and trading will not resume until the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783. Beverley remained on his plantation in Essex County and rode out the entirety of the war, not getting involved in any capacity. At the end of the war, he begins trading with England once again, but his family has grown very large. Of his 16 children, 12 lived to adulthood. In a letter to Liverpool-based factor that I began to work with after the war, he noted, quote, "The largeness of my family compels me to observe a strict economy in the maintenance of my children." Robert Beverley died at his home on April 12th, 1800. That's his home right there. Robert Beverley's letter book is filled with rich correspondence. This lecture focused just on his personal clothing purchases, but the letters also detail specific purchases for the rest of his family and the enslaved Africans working on his plantations. Both really deserve their own lectures, and hope to present on those at a later date. Robert Beverley was a very atypical Virginian, but lived a typical life as a member of the Virginia elite, consuming globally produced goods through England. I hope this short talk helped to show the complexity of ordering goods from London, both in the good and bad of times, from rural Essex County, and the array of tradesmen, of course, needed to clothe just a single person. Thank you. Questions? Yes. It depends a lot, and we see this in Beverley's accounts. One of the biggest problems they deal with is hurricanes, and so there's a big lag time, beginning of summer through the late fall period. So he is trying to order in the winter to receive it by the spring, because you also have to include the time, if we're talking about also delivery of goods, the making, which also takes time too. So, but yeah, you're talking a couple weeks, a month. I think when he came over, it was 6 weeks, but he's coming up through the Caribbean, and he thought it was an extremely long time to travel from England to Virginia. Yeah.
So the fashions that you showed in the 1760s were all in color, all blue, all right. Did that fashion change around the 1770s, 74 in England and Tidewater, or just Tidewater like red and blue?
That's a great question. So in Virginia, the Tidewater area in Virginia, they are very boring. They tend to be very, I think if we look at it today, very conservative in their dress, very good quality fabrics, but they don't tend to be very flashy. But this is regionally different. So if you go to Charleston, for example, you're going to find a lot more gold fabrics, like actual metal gold fabrics, gold trims, silver mountings, embroidery, as compared to, let's say, the more austere, even so in Philadelphia with the Quaker merchants, who are nothing but drab colors. So a lot of it is very regional differences, and it's remarked on. And so the Virginians in the Tidewater area, they're oftentimes just described just like their furniture. Everything is neat and plain. So it's very good quality. It's very neat, but it's very plain.
Is there a cultural reason that, like, part of the gentleman farmer thing versus southern aristocrat?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. It may be it's sort of a part of that, but it just seems like they're not that interested in showing off their wealth by wearing it. Whereas if you're in Charleston, that's quite the opposite. They like really extravagant stuff. You know, and this can be documented not only through clothing purchases, but portraits and extant pieces. So. I'm sure he bought locally, but this is the only bit of evidence that survives from him other than his house and his extant pieces that descended through his family. The family owned this house until the 1990s. They had a lot of kids, a lot of descendants. I guarantee he is buying things locally, but because his money is centered in tobacco, which is being sold in London, he has credit through those factors. So he's buying directly. It's also generally cheaper to buy in London and have it shipped here than to buy in the colonies.
So like William Carlin and Taylor,
Yep.
Alexander,
Yep.
all of his business was altering goods that came from
Yep,
London.
exactly.
I'm sort of curious if that's the same thing.
I'm sure. Now he is in the sticks. Even today, he is kind of out there in Essex County. So, but he certainly, may have come into Williamsburg or gone somewhere else to have things made or altered.
Yeah, there's a great line from Washington. You probably know this. He writes, essentially, he says, "Please make these the size the measurements I include, and not the size you think I have."
Yeah, right. Yeah, the other ones that always gets me is make me a suit for a boy who's about 6 years old. Like I have a daughter, and she's very tall for 6. So it's like, how do you judge that? But again, they still ultimately want to buy it from London because it's fashionable and it's cheaper. One of the things you find a lot for people who come over here is they complain about how expensive things are here in the colonies comparatively, which is interesting.
Okay, Katie. Probably, but he's so it's quite common, but so specific about
Yeah.
exactly what he's interested in, and like the shattered coat.
Yep.
Where is he getting his, I guess, inspiration from? So is it his peers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. Yep, sorry. Yep. So the question is, where is he getting his inspiration from for his clothing? He spent half of his life by the time he orders that in London. So he's certainly, and he's in Middle Temple, very fashionable area, Fleet Street, the Strand. So probably early on, he is definitely drawing from London fashion, and they all draw from London fashion, but a little bit more immediate London fashion. Later on, it's interesting. He started buying these fustian frocks, these jean breeches and waistcoats, a lot more utilitarian stuff, which could be easily made here in Virginia. So I think he's then seeing the need for more utilitarian things. Maybe he's not breaking out that shag frock as much. He's a very domestic guy, and he says it in his letters. Like he's like a homebody. He likes to be at home. And he says it over and over again in his letters, which is really kind of funny for somebody in 1770s.
Along the same lines as Katie's question, I know that advertisements for things like furniture down in Charleston, the cabinet prints, it lately arrived from London, a new upholsterer or something, or trained in the London style. Where are the clothers in getting their training or their inspiration for their styles? Is London the epicenter, or is it coming from somewhere else?
Right. So the question was, where is where's the training for the epicenter of English tailors? Where are they getting their stylistic choices from? So the English and the French battle in between one another for whoever has the most fashionable things, and they're constantly copying one another. It's said that the French copy a lot of the English country dress, the informal styles, whereas the English kind of copy bits and pieces of the French better quality things, I guess you might say, like embroidered waistcoat panels and things like that. But I think a lot of it is going to be how you learned from your master as an apprentice to create those shapes. And so for the menswear, it always takes forever. Men's fashion is very slow to change. It's just slower than the way women's fashion is changing at that point. So the London Tradesmen, which is a great little book that was written for parents who are getting ready to apprentice their children in 1747. He says that a tailor should be able to easily steal the cut of a flap by a gentleman who's getting in and out of a chariot. So a lot of it is, I think, probably how you're taught and what also your customers are demanding, what they're seeing too. So there's probably quite a bit of talk between the customer and the tailor. Because essentially, as an individual in the 18th century, you design your own clothing. There's very little off-the-rack clothing available for men and women at this point. Yeah.
So we heard a lot about Mr. Beverley. I'm biased. What
Yeah.
about Mrs. Beverley? Did she work her?
So that's a great question. We have just a few pieces of evidence. Sorry. What do we know about Mrs. Beverley, Mariah Carter Beverley? Sorry. We have a few hints at their relationship in terms of clothing. There are no gown purchases, but he is buying textiles for her. He buys her a set of garnet necklace and a hairpiece and a ring, and it was worth 85 pounds, extremely expensive. We have a little bit more information on the kids. He starts buying a lot of shoes, but there's not much. There is not much on her. She comes from an extremely wealthy family as well, the Carters, Landon Carter. And yeah, there's not a lot. She buys shoes. We do have shoes listed for her, but she's going to another shoemaker, which is interesting. He lists that she's going to buy shoes from Gresham, who's a really sort of a brand name. It's like Manolo Blahnik in London. But he says specifically that he has her measurements. So this must be continuing over from when she was ordering shoes at an earlier period.
Maybe that explains that blank piece because he got married and then all the money went to her clothes.
Yeah, well, some of that, the other piece to that is that in the late 60s, he also starts building that. So he's really kind of like cooking up the idea. He's kind of starting to cook up this idea by the time he gets married, because he's currently living in his father's house and it's just too old fashioned for him. So, yeah.
This is a little off topic, but so many of the pictures, the man has their hand inside their coat. Is there any?
Just fashionable, just a fashionable posture for an individual. The question is, why do we see so many portraits with men with their hands in their coats? Just a fashionable posture for the period. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's connection with this idea of like manly restraint,
Sure,
and the calmness and leadership as well.
Yep.
Which is the same reason Napoleon would have been pictured thus when he was trying to put out that vibe.
So does that imply that she was doing her own clothing purpose?
She could have been, but I don't think so. I think that he is mostly ordering for the estate, because the thing is, when he does get married and gets married and then starts having children, he is not only, like, when we go through all these letters, he's also buying huge amounts of clothing for his enslaved workers, thousands of yards of wool, thousands of yards of linen, but it's all kind of lumped together. It's not really separated out. Sometimes he'll put in 25 yards of the best India print for Mrs. B. He always calls her Mrs. B, which is kind of cute. I think it's just funny. So we do get that every once, but it's kind of hard to parse out. Some of it's easy. Kendall cotton, definitely for the enslaved workers. He buys fear not jackets in large sizes, and he complains about it because as the wool was very inferior for enslaved men working on his plantations. But then it also begs the question, who's turning all of this fabric that he's buying into enslaved clothing for the enslaved working on the plantations? So there's got to be somebody who's doing that cutting, at least the cutting. So,
Which leads to, do you have many records of his enslaved?
no, not much. Do we have any records of the enslaved laborers working at Blandfield? I haven't gone digging into that section yet because it's a lot and it's spread out. He has 3,000 acres in Tidewater, another 100,000 acres that he's, collecting rents on in the Shenandoah Valley. And so he has a very large enslaved population that he is clothing every single year. Yeah. They seem to be getting clothing twice a year, which was typical for most Virginia planters. Sort of a spring issuance and then a fall issuance.
Right. Thank you very much.